I grew up very Catholic, Roman Catholic, Polish Catholic. So I guess you could say we're a little bit more strict than your average Christian. This whole entire time growing up, I always wanted a connection to God, but I just didn't, I had that connection all along. I was capable to have that connection, but I just didn't know how to build a relationship with God. And Judaism taught me how to do that with the tools that it offered. That was just kind of my wake-up call. Judaism, you don't have to go far to find it. It's right here. You could find meaning in anything. Just have to have the proper mindset and the right intentions.
Hi everyone, I'm Menachem Learfield, and this is 0%, where we explore the outsized impact of the Jewish people. This season, we're focusing on stories of Jews by choice, people who have chosen a Jewish way of life. And we are so honored to have with us today a newfound speaker, Tehilla Bollag. Tehilla, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting.
Of course. So Tehilla, I want to make the most of our time here today, as best as we can. Maybe let's, start at the beginning. So where are you from originally? What was your early life like?
My name is Tehilla, and originally I am from Warsaw, Poland. It's where the blonde hair, blue eyes come from. And I was raised in Chicago. So I left Poland when I was a young girl, and that's why you don't hear an accent. So I was raised in Chicago, and that's where I grew up. And huge, Jewish community in Chicago, that too, but huge Polish population in Chicago. So yeah, growing up, I actually learned English when I was in the first grade. So that was that. And I grew up very Catholic, Roman Catholic, Polish Catholic. So I guess you could say we're a little bit more strict than your average Christian. And growing up, I remember from a young age, we would go to church every Sunday. And when I was about 9 years old, I remember prepping for my first communion ever. And that is when you gear up, you learn all these prayers, and you go and confess your sins to a priest. Every Saturday, I was in Polish school where I would learn Polish reading, writing, and then afterwards, a nun would come in and she would teach us about religion. And like I said before, church every Sunday, and I always had to go. I always would try to play sick or say, I had a stomach ache or didn't feel well. And every single Sunday, I would hear my parents coming up the steps and I would hide under my covers oh man, it's that time.
Was that just because you were a kid and it was boring, or was there something about it that rubbed you the wrong way?
I never asked too many questions and I just went with the flow. But to me, when I was about 9 years old, 10 years old, right, church was just boring. I would sit there and I would just wait for it to be over. And that was my younger years growing up. But when I got a little bit older, I really tried to connect to my religion because it was so important to my parents. And I wanted it to be important to me as well. But even though I tried, it just never really clicked. It never resonated with me. And I remember when I was 16 years old, I would sit in church with my family and I would just try to connect. I would try to listen to what the priest was saying and nothing. No internal excitement or even external excitement. It was just the same thing. And it was the same as my younger years. So one day when I turned 17 years old, I saved up enough money to buy a car after communion gifts and birthday gifts and all the holidays. And after I got my own car and I started working, I had the opportunity or the flexibility to go to church myself. And what would I do? A 17-year-old who has the freedom to go to church herself. I would tell my parents I was going, but I never went back.
The church was really the mall.
It was really the mall. Or sometimes I would just drive around for 1 hour, go to a friend's house.
And they thought you were going to a different church.
No, I went at different times because when I was 17 years old, I was working. There's different times you could go to mass. So 9 a.m., 10 a.m., whatever. And I would drive around. And I remember one of those days when I was driving around, I had a conversation with God. And here I am in my Honda Civic on my way to church that Sunday. I'm like, okay, today I'm going to go. And I'm driving and I'm 5 minutes and I'm 10 minutes away. And then I'm 5 minutes away. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go. And then I turn the other way, opposite direction. And I continue my driving. And I'm like, okay, God, like, I really want to connect to you, but maybe one day again, I'll be religious. But right now, it's just not the time for me. I'm young. I'm going to live life on my own terms. And one day maybe I'll come back, but just not right now. And since that moment, I never went to church again. And what did I do? I lived life on my own terms. And 18, 19, 20 years old, I started working. You know, I had
You have
3
siblings,
jobs.
by the way?
Yeah, I have a younger brother and a younger sister. I'm the oldest, but there's a huge age gap in between us. My brother is 8 years younger than me, and my sister is like 13 years younger than me.
So when you were going through all this, you didn't like talk with them about it because they were so little. Like it wasn't even.
They were little, yeah. They didn't understand, and I was really on my own. You know, I was independent. I was speaking to my parents also. They're just like tough immigrant mentality.
You never really had a conversation with them about how this wasn't or wasn't a good fit.
What do you mean? Back then, it's like, what do you mean this isn't a good fit? Something's wrong, you know? Like everyone's doing it. You have to do it. You have to keep going. It wasn't spoken about so much. They knew I didn't like going, but they're like, she'll grow out of it. But interestingly enough, obviously we'll get there in a second, I converted to Judaism, but a lot of the foundations that I learned were actually from my parents. They were just not expounded upon as much as Judaism. But for example, praying, right? I would pray in the morning before school with my father and at night before going to bed when I was Catholic. And I still kept my prayers to God going even after 17. So like I always had a concept of God in my life. And that was because of my family and everything they taught me. Sometimes our family wants us to turn out a certain way. And I'm religious today. I pray. I believe in God. Maybe it wasn't the way that they pictured it, but thank God they're happy and they're supportive. They're like, okay, we didn't picture you being this extreme, but at least you believe in God and you have a solid foundation and belief system in religion. So thank
I
God.
love
They're very
that.
happy.
I want to explore that more, like your parents' reaction and how that all went down. But
Yeah.
walk us through. So again, you're in your story, at least chronologically, you're about 18.
17 to like 22. I'm just gonna breeze by it. You know, I'm a young
I feel like most of us wish we could like breeze by our 17 to 22-year-old age. But yeah.
I know it's a tough age. Let's just say a lot of exploring in terms of work, different activities, a lot of different friend groups. In my 20s, I was working a lot, young, fun, going out with friends. The parties went up until like 6 a.m. in the morning. It was a whole different lifestyle that today I look back, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. But it was, but back then I thought, wow, this is living. I did whatever I want, what I wanted. No one told me what to do. No one told me what time to be home. I had this freedom and I really thought it was liberating to be in that position. But after some time, I feel like a lot of times when you listen to people's stories and how they found meaning and purpose, it's like, okay, I was at a party and then I just like was sitting in a corner and I just thought, wow, what's the purpose of life? Am I going to continue doing this until I'm 30, 40 years old? That didn't happen to me. I was having a great time. I actually stumbled across Judaism accidentally. Well, nothing happens on accident, but
Is it serendipitously?
yes, exactly.
Like unplanned by you?
Unplanned, by someone else. But It's like kind of like the Purim story. In Purim, it's like after everyone, after when they wrote the Megillah, which is the reading that we read on Purim, the book, right?
Yeah, the Book of Esther.
The Book of Esther. And until I think 12 years later, they were writing it and they're like, oh yeah, this all makes sense. God was involved the whole time. So that was kind of like my story as well. So here I was.
It's so interesting you mentioned that. I don't know if you saw our episode last month, but our guest also referenced the Purim story and how she felt like her life was so similar to that of this concept of like zooming out and, writing that story and seeing where God's hand was, leading you through that process.
Through the whole time.
And
Yeah.
it's an amazing thing. Like you think about Purim, it's not just about listening to this cool story and being like, oh, that was a great story. It's about writing your own Megillah. And so often we don't go through that process of trying to zoom out and see where God's hand led us, step by step to where we are now. But it's amazing that you can look back and really see that in your life.
Yes. I'm living my best life. I'm having fun. I'm making money. I'm going out with friends, doing everything that, the secular world glorifies it as living your best life. You only live once motto, right? That's what you should do. So here I was, not looking for meaning or purpose. And when I was about 19 years old, I started working in a restaurant in Skokie, Illinois, which was 20 minutes from my mom's house where I lived at the time. And when I started working in that community, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Chicago, but Skokie.
I went to grad school in Chicago at Loyola.
Oh, perfect.
And Skokie is my favorite place in the world because it's the home of Ken's Diner.
Diner, yes, I ate there once actually.
We went on a trip to Chicago I think we were there for 12 hours with my wife. We went in for a wedding. And I made her, we went to Ken's Diner for breakfast, lunch, and second dinner. So we went there like 3 times in 12 hours. But
okay, it's either Ken's Diner or it's either Shallott's. So
yeah, I'm a Ken's Diner all the way. But
I know I love fast food as well. Don't worry. So definitely get you on that. But the second most I guess a lot of times when you say, oh, I'm from Chicago, everyone's like, what's that one good restaurant?
Yeah,
and it's
Shallott's.
So, or Ken's, but that's second. But so Shallott's. So at 19 years old, I got a job working in a restaurant in the same parking lot as Shallott's, which is across the street from the Skokie Yeshiva, the yeshiva. And back then, I had no idea about Jews. I never met a Jew before in my life. I went to a secular public school where the majority of the population and the kids were, either Hispanic or white or, Polish like me, and just regular American. We only learned about Jewish people in I think I remember like history class or something for a second. So when I started working in Skokie, I started meeting people who were Jewish. I started meeting people all types of Jews, not necessarily visible Jewish on the outside, but people with last names. I started getting exposed to people with last names like Goldberg and whatever Jewish last names are. And sometimes at work, I would speak to these people. And then at the end, a holiday would be around or something. And I'd be like, oh, what are you doing for Christmas? And they would say, well, it's actually Hanukkah. I'm Jewish. So I just got little bits and pieces of tastes of Judaism then. But after,
And that was really your first exposure to Jews ever at 19 years old.
Yeah, right. But just being in Skokie made me meet Jewish people. And through work, I ended up meeting way more Jewish people from different backgrounds. Holiday Jews who I guess just kept the holidays, and more modern Jews who, or maybe people who grew up religious and who weren't so religious were in that stage of their life. So that's how I started meeting Jewish people. And then a few years later, I believe I was like 22 years old, I met people who were Orthodox. And to me, they looked the same. maybe they weren't necessarily wearing a kippah, or the girls weren't necessarily wearing like visibly Jewish long skirts. But when I started meeting people who were Orthodox, I remember the way that I found out they were Orthodox is that I would try to make plans with them on Friday nights. And here I was getting, ready for work on a Friday night. Uh, and I would text my friends, hey, come visit me at work, or let's go out this Friday. And they would always have the same response. And that was that, oh, we can't, we're spending time with family. Because how do you explain to a non-Jew what Shabbos is over text? Or it's more complex than that. But after a while, I started to catch on. Every single Friday night, they're spending time with family, and then they don't text me back until Sunday or Saturday night. It was just really, really strange.
Was it off-putting? Did you think they were ghosting you, or you just thought something must be going on?
No, I just thought it was a little strange. Also, I was always preoccupied with work, and I knew people had other stuff going on. But it was actually really funny. One of the times when Shabbat came earlier, I think it was around September or October time when Shabbat comes in earlier, so the sun sets earlier. So the way that I caught on is one time my friends would text me, and Shabbat came an hour earlier, so they would stop texting me an hour earlier each week. And I'm like, wait, last week you stopped at this time, out this time. So over a course of some time, something just didn't add up. So I finally confronted them, why are you guys so weird? What's going on? Fill me in. So eventually they told me, well, we're Orthodox Jews and we keep this thing called Shabbos. And I'm like, Jews? I know Jews. I've met a ton of Jews at the restaurant I work at. And they said, okay, yeah, they're Jewish, but we're a different type of Jewish. And so through my friends who were Orthodox, I learned about Shabbos, and eventually I learned about kosher, and then eventually learned about the holidays. And quickly I became the non-Jew in the group, that was learning all these fascinating ideas. And it was very eye-opening for me to see people who were, in my stage of life, who were my age, but they had a different set of values, which I've never seen before in the secular world. And that opened my eyes, and that piqued my curiosity to this whole concept called Judaism, or religion in the first place. Because growing up, I knew people who were also religious Catholics, religious, die-hard Christians, but their values didn't nowhere compare to these people who I met who were Orthodox and religious.
What were some of those values that really inspired you the most?
So for me also, at first, when I learned about Shabbos, I said, okay, how are people who are 21, 22 years old spend time with family on a Friday night when that is prime going out time with friends? And I just couldn't wrap my head around how people had the ability to say no. And I think a lot of people, when they first hear about Shabbos as well, they think about the concept of, wow, no technology. Me, I'm even though I'm on social media, for me, I could put my phone away and not worry about it for a few hours. But just the concept that other people were capable to do that as well, because we live in a society where we are technology glued, that really was eye-opening for me as well. And also, I think a big thing is the way they conducted themselves, the way they spoke to other people with respect, and the way they addressed people who were respectable figures in the community and stuff like that. Just a little bits and pieces of what I found interesting.
So it sounds like it was really, at least your discovery to Judaism was a very organic process. You weren't actively seeking it. It was your friend group. A lot of them happened to have been these Orthodox Jews, and they kind of almost through osmosis, you picked up on all these different things that they were doing, their practices, their values, their rituals. And then how did that lead to you eventually deciding that this is what you wanted for your life?
Oh, and then I also forgot to mention that they were successful in terms of their careers. They had stuff going for them. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm joking. I'm joking. Because when I'm growing up, I was 22 years old and I was hanging out with people who were building businesses. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's really fascinating for me to see as well. So here I was, 22 years old, 23. It's all mixed together, but here I was learning about Judaism, and I remember hanging out with my friends one day, and one of them mentioned a Jewish outreach class, which was geared towards people who weren't religious to learn about Judaism. So that's, I guess, like it's a Kiruv class, right? So I heard about this Jewish outreach class, this Kiruv class, and it was actually down the block from my house, or 2 blocks down from where I lived at the time. And this whole time, I was just curious about Judaism. I asked my friends, I'm like, hey, can I go to the class? I thought it's just like something you could show up to and learn, because a lot of, mostly all religions, correct me if I'm wrong, they're very welcoming. Oh, you want to learn about us? Come, come, You don't need an invite. Just let us teach you what we believe in. So I thought Judaism was the same way. And then my friends were laughing. They're like, okay, we have a problem here. So, but somehow one of my friends got in touch with the rabbi, and got in touch with another rabbi, and miraculously, I got into this Jewish outreach class in Chicago, which is run by Rabbi Garfinkel, and his organization.
I know him well, yeah.
Yeah, is Project 613. So Rabbi Garfinkel gets this call, and he's like, okay, I get these calls often. But he always turns people down. But for some reason, he said, okay, if she comes, referring to me, to 6 of my classes, then she could come. If she commits to coming to each and every single one. So I said, okay, I'm done. Let's do it. They were on a Wednesday night around like 7 p.m. So I remember getting dressed up for this Jewish outreach class. And a lot of times the people I was hanging out with now were Orthodox. So what did I do? I'm like, okay, Jews, let's put on a turtleneck. And I had a shirt. And here I was walking to the class. It was like January time. It was winter. It was freezing outside. And I was so excited to meet my first Orthodox rabbi. But I completely had the wrong impression, because when I met him, he was nothing like I pictured a religious person to be like. My family and I, when I was younger, had priests over for lunch, and they would be very serious. You couldn't really talk to them. You couldn't really have a conversation with them. Yeah, exactly. They would just sit there and meet my first Orthodox rabbi, and he goes, hello, welcome to Judaism. And I was like, oh man, I was not expecting that welcome. Okay, so I was off to a good start. And then I walk into the classroom, and people are looking around, and they thought I was what they would say a rebbitzin, because I had my long skirt on, I had my turtleneck on, and then someone turns to me like, oh, do you work with the rabbi? And thinking this, what's a rebbitzin is like a rabbi's wife, right? They didn't think I was the rabbi's wife, but they thought, I was.
Certainly
Whatever.
They thought you were like another Orthodox Jew because you looked the part.
Exactly. So I was laughing at this moment. I'm like, oh my gosh, talk about being overdressed, because everyone else was wearing jeans and short sleeve shirts, and I come overdressed. But anyways, I still.
Which is so funny, because you specifically dressed that way to try to fit in, and then you realize this is not the group that I'm a part of.
Right, exactly. So the next time, don't worry, I put on my jeans and I put on my whatever I was comfortable in. And so that was my first time meeting an Orthodox rabbi. And then that was really my first time learning about Judaism in depth. Week 1, we learned about the Aleph, Beis, and I had no idea what was going on.
Hebrew alphabet.
The Hebrew alphabet, yeah. So we learned about that. We learned about the mitzvot. And we learned about how there are so many ways to connect to God through doing physical actions. And that was my first time I was exposed to a connection to God other than just praying and, spirituality. So that was very cool for me. Week 2 of the Jewish outreach class, we were still learning. I made some friends. And week 3, I remember we were learning about Purim, speaking of Purim, because it was coming up. And I remember the rabbi brought dough for us to make hamantaschen.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea what these cookies look like. So here I am making my hamantaschen, rolling my dough, putting the jelly in it. And the rabbi's walking around like, it looks like, the room. He's like, okay, Abby, that's a good one. Okay, great. And then he comes over to me and then he looks at my hamantaschen and he goes, yours looks like a cross, but we're working on it. And I'm like, that's it. This rabbi's hilarious, and like it was very nice. I felt very welcomed. And all this time I was learning about Judaism for 3-4 weeks. And Eric Garfinkel was hosting a Purim party in West Rogers Park. And I was really wanted to go. So I asked one of the girls in the class if she would go with me. And the day of the Purim party came. And I drove to West Rogers Park and I put my skirt back on because I'm in a religious community. I want to fit in. So we get to the person's house who was hosting the Purim party. And I knock on the door. My heart's beating very fast because I don't know what to expect. And when we knock...
It's one thing like meeting this rabbi, in a neutral territory, but now you're kind of on his turf.
Yes.
And like in this Orthodox community, what was going through your mind at that time? Like, what were you anxious about? Just being judged or...
Being judged, being different. And it was just scary. But you know me, I'm just like very easygoing, optimistic. I'm like, hey, what's the worst that could happen? So I knock on the door and...
Did you get friends to come with you?
Yes, a friend came with me, so it was less stressful as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you knock on the door.
I knock on the door, and finally I meet the Rebbitzin, the one that people thought I was in the beginning of class, and I meet a true Rebbitzin, and I'm like, and she goes, hi, it's so nice to meet you. My husband told me all about you. And it was just such a nice and genuine, warm welcome. She barely knew me, but she saw me for who I was, a genuine girl just trying to learn more about Judaism. And she liked me for me. A lot of times in the secular world, people base things on external factors. And when I got noticed, she really noticed me for who I was internally. And that sort of opened the door for, first off, the Purim party. And second, for me to be truly who I was. I didn't have to put on a fake act. And not that I did when I was younger, but it just felt so genuine and so real. So after I walk into the Purim party, immediately felt welcomed. I see a party. And
you're like, I know what this is. I know how to do this.
Exactly. I'm like, okay, this is good. I'm happy this was my first impression because, I'm like, I got this.
I always say it's so sad to me that so many Jews only experience Judaism on the 2 most boring days of the whole year. And they come to Shalom, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And I'm like, forget about Yom Kippur. Just come on Purim. If that was your first experience with Judaism, it would be such a different, eye-opening experience.
I agree. And I think if I would have experienced Judaism, we were learning about Yom Kippur, it would have been a little bit different, a whole other world for me. But like I said, God took me by the hand.
But again, that's part of your Megillah. Is like you were exposed to what you need to be exposed to, when and where and how.
But you know what? This was a very different type of party than the one that I was used to. It was like God took me by the hand and he said, all right, girlfriend, I know this is something different, but let me show you how we party. And here's purpose and meaning. And you see this cup of wine that you've been drinking? Let's make a blessing on it, a bracha, and elevate it to something greater. And it was just a party filled with spirituality and meaning and purpose. And who said life's greatest moments aren't within the big parties of our lives? That was one of my greatest moments. And I remember the next morning, I woke up with the best spiritual hangover that I could ever have. And one more thing. Also, I remember when I saw the party set up in the host's house that we were at, their whole entire dining room or living room didn't have furniture. It was just one big table filled with 50 people. And this was so shocking to me because growing up, or not growing up, in my 20s, I saw people spend money on the most ridiculous things for enjoyment or pleasure. But here, people who were successful, but they took their money and they spent it on others to host them and to throw a party like this, which I never saw before in my life. And that was very moving for me as well to see that. So after that Purim party, I continued to learn about Judaism, and then COVID hit. But I started learning with Rabbi Garfinkel. He had his classes online. I bought some modest clothes from Shein, which is like a Chinese website. So I had some like dresses, which I thought were modest, but at the time, not so much, not something that I would wear now. But slowly but surely, I just started becoming more Jewish.
At any point in that process, did you think that you would actually like take the leap and become Jewish, or it was just like a cool thing you were exploring? Like, when did that switch? When did that change over for you?
It was definitely something that I was exploring, and it was something that I was doing slowly. I was still very curious, and I met other friends and who I spent Shabbat with them. I would go with them for like Shabbat meals. I would like drive in Friday nights and drive back home. I'd be so embarrassed to drive back home. Like I wasn't even Jewish, but it was I was just like so shy too, and it was totally fine for me to do it. But I was exploring, and the moment when I realized that I really wanted to convert to Judaism was few months later. So Purim party was around March time. In around September time, when Rosh Hashanah, I think 2020, Rosh Hashanah 2020 is when I decided to become Jewish. And I'll tell you how that happened. Rabbi Garfinkel was hosting a Shabbaton, like a big Shabbos get together for his students in West Riders Park. And he put me up in the same person's house who hosted the Purim party to sleep in for Rosh Hashanah. And that moment, I was like,
oh, the Purim party wasn't at Rabbi Garfinkel's house?
No, it was at somebody else's house.
Can I ask who they were? Do you know? I mean, obviously you know.
Yes.
Share?
They're very involved in Rabbi Garfinkel's organization. They're called the Broners.
Broner?
Yes.
Okay, very nice. Shout out to the Broners, whoever you are, wherever you are.
Yes, shout out to the Broners. And so here I am. I am going to sleep over, spend the holiday at the Broners' house, Rosh Hashanah. And I remember sitting there, I spent Friday night or the first meal with them, and we had the plate with all the
symbolic food.
Yeah, the food. And we had the plate there, and then it was a nice meal. But what really changed my, I guess, my whole perspective on Judaism was when I was getting ready for shul, for synagogue, the next morning. And I remember making my coffee, and I was very nervous, and I had my art scroll siddur, and I left the house, and I'm walking in West Riders Park, obviously with my modest Shein dress on and my coats, and I'm walking down the street to the synagogue, and I remember passing other Jews, and I'm like, oh gosh, they know I'm not Jewish. They're probably like, what is she doing here? But I remember passing other Jews on the street, and they greeted me with, it was Shabbos and the holiday all in one. So they would say good Shabbos, and they would say good Yantip, which is something that you say on the holidays as well. So they would greet me, and here I was, I felt welcomed by the community. Even though I'm tall, I'm blonde, I don't look like I fit in. But here I am carrying the siddur, and now I'm like, after I pass a few people, I'm literally skipping to synagogue now because I felt so welcome. And good Shabbos, good Yontiv, anyone to who I pass. And to this day, saying good Shabbos actually to people it brings me joy because
You
I just
remember?
remember,
Yeah.
yeah, back when I wasn't Jewish, and it was so nice to me. So it felt so welcoming, and I felt a part of the community. So it's tradition till this day. So I remember walking to synagogue, and it was outside because it was COVID. And I walked to my seat where Rabbi Garfinkel had reserved for his students. I walked to my seat, find my seat, and I open up my siddur. And the next person next to me is 10 feet away, and the other person's 10 feet away. And I have no idea what page we're on. But, after I open my siddur and I stand there, and then after a while, I like kind of look what's going on. And again, I'm like, hey, I've been to church plenty of times. It's like you just do what they do. So, here I am with my siddur. I stand, I sit, I sway, I kneel on the ground at some point. I'm like, oh, yeah, got this one down, So here I was. And then after I finally, got my rhythm, and I guess I started just reading everything in the siddur because art school has Hebrew, and thank God it has English also. So I just started reading, and there I was, and I was reading, and I just felt so embraced, so loved, and so connected to God in that moment, even though I had no idea what was going on, even though
Was there any explanation like beforehand or during? It wasn't like an explanatory service. This was like the main regular service. So did you not feel completely lost? I mean, yes, you can kind of play the role.
yes, for a moment, I did feel completely lost, but I think it helped that COVID helped, social distancing helped, that no one was like, oh, what page is she on? Oh, I wasn't consciously thinking I'm on the wrong page, or, I'm lost. So I was all alone, really, social distancing. No one was near me. So I didn't have that anxiety of, oh gosh, they know I'm not on the right page. And, it really,
The
really helped.
imposter syndrome.
Yes. So after that, I just continued reading. And then before I knew it, the synagogue service was over. And while I was reading, I was like, wow, this whole entire time growing up, I always wanted a connection to God, but I just didn't I had that connection all along. I was capable to have that connection, but I just didn't know how to build a relationship with God. And Judaism taught me how to do that with the tools that it offered. So that was just like kind of my wake up call. And after Rosh Hashanah, I was driving home, and I told myself I'm going to keep this whole holiday before I went. What is keep the whole holiday? I had no idea how to keep the holiday. I just didn't use my phone for the whole time. So
That's a big step.
yes, and it was a 3-day holiday because it was Shabbat and then it was the holiday, so it was a long time. But I remember driving back home, and I was in my car, and I was like beaming. I had that it felt like my soul was dancing inside me. It's weird. That's the best that I could explain it. I just felt that.
Love that.
Yeah, I was just driving back in my car back home, and I was just so happy. And I'm like, okay, that's it. God, I'm in. You convinced me. I want to convert to Judaism. So a few weeks after that, I got in touch with the Bezdin, which is the rabbinical court in Chicago. And
The CRC.
yes, the CRC. And I gave them a phone call. I called them. No one answered the phone. I'm like, oh, thank God. But I left them a voicemail, and I said, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I want to become Jewish. So let me know. Bye. I had no idea how to come across this, but whatever, it happens. And eventually they connected me with the sponsoring rabbi. And that was really how my conversion journey started.
And how long did that whole process take?
Took a year and 7 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were there like bumps along the road, or was for the most part smooth sailing?
Definitely bumps along the road, but also it was smooth sailing. I think the biggest challenge for me was I had to be patient, because when you're converting to Judaism, there's also no roadmap to tell you how to go about it. You really just figure it out for yourself, and there's no guidebook on
Right, because each person's journey is different and each person's process.
Yeah, everyone's different also, and everyone's process could take a longer time. And also it depends where everyone is in their lives at that moment, because you have to move into a Jewish community. When I started my conversion, I was already keeping Shabbos, and eating kosher, and for the most part, dressing modestly. So those are like the three big ones, I would say. And then after that, everything else came gradually. They gave you a whole list of books. The books are probably like,
I've been through the CRC process. I've seen it. It's quite a
so
rigorous
like,
process
yeah. So you
and
really
very
don't know.
intimidating. I would say being a sponsoring rabbi and just sitting in on some of those sessions, like I felt intimidated. I can't even
Yes,
imagine what it must be like being on the other side of that. And especially like it looks like an actual courtroom, right? With the
yes.
tall, like the bench and the big chairs, and it's intimidating.
Yeah, my first two meetings were actually on Zoom because of COVID. So it was a little bit better. So my third meeting was the meeting when I met the rabbis for the last time, or for the third time, and it was still intimidating even after three times each time.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's quite a journey. If
Yeah.
looking back now, is there one thing you can point to and say, like, this is the thing that you find most meaningful about Judaism? Or what I'd love our listeners to hear is, so often as Jews, we take Judaism for granted. We grow up with it and we kind of either ignore it or don't really appreciate what it is and what it has to offer. But getting an outside perspective from someone who didn't grow up with it, like what is something that you look at and you're like, that is Judaism. That is what brings you to Judaism. And
Something about Judaism that I found meaningful is that Judaism, you don't have to go far to find it. It's right here. You could find meaning in anything. Just have to have the proper mindset and the right intentions. This bottle of water, right? When I was Catholic, how do I make this spiritual? I don't know. I have no idea. I couldn't link physicality and spirituality together. But if I'm drinking this water and I'm in the middle of nowhere and I'm in a desert, I could connect to God that way. How? By saying a blessing on it and elevating it to something greater, right? That was my first impression actually experiencing Judaism.
I
And
love that because that's such a foundational part of Judaism.
yeah,
You mentioned the idea of blessings. We only make a blessing on something involving the body. We cannot make a blessing if it doesn't involve the body, because the declaration of the blessing we say is Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav, that you, God, sanctified us, you made us holy. And if we're not using the physical world, then it's by definition, from a Jewish perspective, not holy, which is so different from our perception of spirituality. We
yes,
think spirituality is removal from the physical, but it's really, like you said, it's elevating the physical.
yeah,
And in that way, the physical becomes spiritual.
yes. That's amazing to me. And also, you don't have to travel far to find God. A lot of people travel thousands of miles to go see a Buddha or to go see a pope or someone to help them. We do travel thousands of miles to see a rabbi, but at the same time, that's besides the fact. But at the same time, especially for me in my situation, I didn't have to go far. God found me. I only had to be open to the idea of pursuing God. The Jewish community is 20 minutes from my mom's house. I didn't have to travel around the world. And at the end of the day, God put me there. And it all really unraveled itself. And here I am today.
You had mentioned this imagery, which I loved, of, your soul dancing. What today about Judaism makes your soul dance?
So I actually would love to do a comparison. I was speaking about this to my husband the other day. When I was Catholic, I remember like the only thing that I really got spirituality from was music. And that's when I felt my soul would dance, right? So to say. But that was like the closest that I got to spirituality. And fun fact that I actually learned, I don't know the source, so don't quote me, but that music was actually taken from the Garden of Eden. and brought with Adam to this world. So that was as a non-Jew, that was the closest that I felt to spirituality, is like when I heard music and it really touched my soul. I know it sounds weird, but
No,
it does.
100%. That's the concept in Judaism. Every number represents different things. And 6 is the physical, and 8 is the spiritual, and 7 is that threshold, that transition from the physical to the spiritual, which is why in music, there's 7 notes on the scale. And then those 7 notes come together to make something that's literally on the threshold, on the transition to something spiritual. And we're told that in the world to come, there's going to actually be an 8th note, and that music will just be fully spiritual. But right now, it's one of those things that, we hear it and we feel something. It brings us to this point that we know that we're feeling something that's almost otherworldly. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so that's how I felt. That was like my only soul connection. I just thought about this not too long ago, a few months ago, and I'm like, oh, wow. But now, after when I experienced my first Purim party, when I knew Judaism was for me, when I listened to a good class that was motivational and that was about God and that I really enjoyed, or when I was in seminary, a lot of times I was in an environment where it was just good. And that's like when I felt that my soul was dancing again. But then fast forward to real life. Hello, it's always so exciting. But I've been a Jew now for 2.5 years. And in reality is that Judaism, it's always going to be exciting, but you have to make it exciting. A lot of people, I guess, who grew up religious, it's just like, hey, they just go through the motions. And me, after 2.5 years of being Jewish, is, Judaism is a job. You have to work. And I want to get my soul dancing. Okay, I have to go. I have to go to a Jewish class. I have to be in an environment where, maybe synagogue on Friday nights when they're singing and it's exciting. So moments like those, or now like with praying, not every day I'm going to feel, okay, this is great. And that's Judaism and that's life and that's okay, because at the end of the day, it's a relationship, right?
Right.
But there are special moments where, or the other day I was making challah, and for the first time, in a while, I'm like, oh my gosh, my soul's dancing again. It comes and goes, and it's really a moment that I cherish.
And I love that you take this active approach to it. You're not waiting for something to do that to you or for you. You're actively seeking those opportunities. And then if we're patient enough and we're looking for it and open to it, then we will experience those moments with the patience and awareness that it's not going to be like that all the time. Things are fresh and exciting when they're new. And often when they become kind of our everyday lives, they become, I don't want to call it boring, but it becomes regular life. And to seek those moments actively, I think is really beautiful. Well, Tehilla, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your story. If it's okay with you, I'll leave information if listeners want to get in touch with you. We'll put them in the show notes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
Okay, our pleasure. Thank you so much. And for everyone else, we look forward to seeing you back here at 0% and all of our other podcasts, which you can find. Again, the link will be in the show notes at joidenver.com/podcasts. Thanks so much. Have a good one.